Hello and welcome to the Paper Prototypes podcast. My name is Rex. I'm your host, and you can also find this podcast on other streaming platforms like Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, and others. And this is my guest Benjamin, who is the dev of Frogmonster. Benjamin, why don't you tell me a little bit about the game?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Frogmonster is kind of a weird mix of things. It's basically an FPS Metroidvania, but it takes some pretty heavy inspiration from games like Hollow Knight, and Dark Souls, and a little bit of like Cuphead kind of boss vibes as well. It's an interesting mix of things, but it's a voxel game. There's a ton of cool exploration and yeah.
So, with how many things that are influencing Frogmonster, how did you manage to combine all of them into a cohesive project?
I think it really started with kind of like a baseline of like, what do I want this to be? And then kind of trying to kind of cut it off after that. So the baseline design for Frog Monster was I wanted really like challenging FPS bosses that really weren't necessarily bullet hell bosses, but also like weren't I don't know, just were like creatures and things that people hadn't really seen before. And then after making a few of them, I think it really just transitioned into like, no, now we're making frog monster things. And it wasn't really an issue anymore with like, I don't know, you know, balancing influences and things because there was a point where it was like, oh, this just feels like naturally what is next in the game, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
It does a little bit. Um, what about the world of Frogmonster? Did you? Well, I guess the better question would be when you started making the project, did you know you wanted to make a game around frogs in the initial idea, or did you just know the influences you wanted to work with?
Well, I guess, Frog Monster started as a project. I wanted to make my own 3D game engine. Um, and kind of from that, there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of playing around with things. And I didn't really necessarily liked how, like, humanoid kind of voxel creations looked. And I think I arrived pretty quickly on like a frog model as the player character, and then from that it kind of evolved to what you see now where there's like eating bugs, and a lot of the mechanics are based around like your tongue and you being a frog, which I thought fit pretty well.
And did you happen to already know a lot about frogs before you started, or did you pick up research along the way?
I would say I've always been like pretty a pretty big reptile and amphibian fan, so I think it was a pretty natural, I guess, transition.
I owned two dumpy tree frogs, so I saw your game. I was like, wish list there, frog game. Here we go.
That's awesome.
uh, so yeah, there's a lot of. Why don't you talk about what elements and mechanics are frog inspired?
I would say there's a few. The main one has got to be there's a charm system, but um, instead of like finding or unlocking the charms, they're all found throughout the game. For example, there's a fly as one of the bugs you can catch, and when you catch it, there's two effects. There's an immediate effect where, like for the fly example, you get a reload speed boost where you reload basically three times faster for I think it's like 10 or 15 seconds or something. And then there's the other half of it where you kind of amass this bug collection and you can equip them similar to charms in other games, and they give you like permanent kind of boosts. Um, and that being, you're a frog, you catch them with your tongue and you kind of explore throughout the areas. I think added a lot of like life to the world as well as like connects exploration and I don't know rewards where like you get to a new biome and the first thing you're thinking about is like where are the new bugs? Where are the new bugs? Um, Other frog related things, there is a tongue swing where you can swing from your tongue. There is some bosses that are themed around you pulling pieces off of them with your tongue. And I'm trying to think of other frog things. And then obviously there's some more that are a little more of a stretch, but I would say those are the core frog themed things.
I made sure to write it in my notes. My favorite detail was when I caught one of the lightning bugs, I got poisoned. Um, for anyone that doesn't
You'd be
know,
surprised at. Oh,
hmm?
sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, for anyone that doesn't know, frogs, they cannot eat lightning bugs. They will get poisoned. Do not feed your frogs them or any wild bug for that matter. There might be parasites.
This is very true. You would be surprised at how many people eat them, realize that they're poisonous and hurt you, and then continue to just impulsively keep eating them.
Yeah, cause like I got the tongue that auto locks on, so for me it was like, oh, I get a buff no matter what I'm eating. So I'm just going around auto grabbing every single bug for the buffs, and I had to untrain that habit when the lightning bugs were appearing because it's like, shit, I'm poisoned. Fuck.
And that auto tongue is so fun to just run around and be like yoink, yoink, yoink. So yeah, it is tempting. Especially they're like, they're a glowing light source right in front of you. Like, how do you not eat them?
Well, the thing I liked a lot about the bugs is that you gave it like a dual use. So not only is it like, okay, so which bugs do I want to equip to give like my frog monster a buff, which is also really useful depending on the fight you're in and like traversal. But
Hmm.
then it becomes a matter of like you're in the middle of a fight, low on health, and it's like, okay, now the arena itself becomes more interesting because now you're looking for insects to try to eat.
Hmm. You have to love the like mid fight, like a boss is about to smash you, and you're just like, oh, quick, I need to catch this frog. I need to heal.
Yeah, except for like I followed one off a cliff one time. And I was like, ah, that was not the smart move. That was not a good idea.
Yeah, that one does happen quite frequently.
You did say that you were working. You started this project by working on your own 3D game engine.
Yes. So Frogmonster's built on a custom engine, and I would say it took me. I don't know. I'm someone who really like enjoys programming, and I don't know. Got to a point where I was interested in learning about computer graphics and about shaders and compute shaders in specific, and kind of was toying around for a while, and ended up with a voxel engine, and then was like, oh, this is great. I should make a game out of this. And then that kind of is how Frog Monster happened.
So, did you have program experience before Frog Monster, or is this your first game?
This is my first commercial game. I've played around with game dev for I don't know, probably almost 10 years now. Um, no, actually, probably more like I would say 8 years. I've played around with game dev, but I don't think it really was a serious thing until starting that engine in 2020, and then Frog Monster in 2021. So it's been a long road. But I also I went to school for computer engineering and learned a lot of programming there as well.
Would you encourage most devs to make their own engine?
No, absolutely not. I still I still like with the specific thing that I was trying to do, I think it worked out because I mean you've seen like the reflections and portals and those kind of things in the game, and I can't imagine that would be easy to pull off in a normal engine. Um, but for pretty much any game, I don't think you can really justify the time and all the troubleshooting of all the little weird like, oh, my system is this and your game doesn't work on my game or on my computer. I would not recommend it for most people.
I wouldn't have even thought about the compatibility. I don't like fucking around with shaders. Too much math. Math make brain hurt.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, you'd be surprised in the Steam forums what people say their system is, and you just close your eyes and are like, what? That's a thing? Like I need to support this?
What's the weirdest one you've gotten?
Someone is running Windows dual boot off of a Mac,
Huh.
and Mac only supports OpenGL through I think a version in 2010, and my version is 2012. So that was an unfortunate like, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't think I can make this work for you.
Yep, that's just another example of dev work that I never would have even considered. I let my game engines do the work for me.
Yes, I think that is for most people. I think that that's the smart way to do things.
Another thing that Frogmonster has strong appeal when it comes for is its visuals. Did you know you wanted to make voxels and was making your own game engine? Did that help with the voxel look?
I would say so. I wanted some kind of like layer. Like I didn't want like a realistic looking game ever. And I think voxels like allow you to be pretty efficient with things, but also I don't know, have a little fun with like everything's gonna look cartoony no matter what. And I think that that's been fun to play around with. But a lot of effort has gone into like each area and making sure that all the colors and shapes and whatever are what I want. And in the beginning, things did not look nearly as nice. I will tell you that much.
I can certainly imagine.
Yeah, things were ugly for a long time.
Did you find that the voxels helped or hindered when it came to the creature designs for all the different enemies?
I would say it helped to some degree to build like a uniformity between them all. Um, I think we're up to 28 bosses now, and like, I mean, you could really look at any of them, and because of how the engine and the lighting and the ambient occlusion is, and also how like, the general style, I feel like you can just tell instantly, like, oh yeah, that's a frog monster boss.
And
I think voxels really help me do that.
speaking of 28 bosses, I think this is one of the game that I've put some of the most hours in when it comes to doing a review podcast, and I feel like I've kind of barely scratched the surface. How do you come up with 28 bosses and still find a way to create meaningful, different, engaging bosses for players to fight?
I think I just zone out a lot. And I don't know, like they always come to me kind of when I'm not trying to come up with a boss, and then I'm like, oh, I gotta write that down. I gotta write that down. And I think over a few years of like letting that happen, I kind of amassed a pretty big list of like, oh, what if that was a boss? And then you try to make it, and of course your idea isn't exactly what works as a boss, but then you adjust it and keep going. But I think the focus for bosses initially is generally like, what if there was a person who did, or like a guy that did this? And then you move from there to like, well, what would that look like? And then you end up at like, whatever the boss looks like. Like, I think a good example is the first boss is Groth. Um, and for anyone that doesn't know, he's kind of like I don't know, he's kind of like a turtle, but has a lily pad on his back. But initially I just wanted a boss that like could stretch his neck out to be a long neck, and the player at that point in the game doesn't have dash yet, so really the only dodging ability you have is just jumping up and down. So I wanted him to kind of snap at you, and whenever his head goes out you have to jump. And that obviously like constrains the body shape and kind of attitude of your boss, and then I think you just go from there.
You also have bosses that I would say aren't traditional bosses, where usually you have like a health bar, but one of the more recent fights I had was a butterfly where you have to change, like, every section hit changes the color of the butterfly's wings, and that's how you progress the flight, is paint by numbers, but at the risk of death.
At the risk of getting stomped into the ground over and over and over again.
On top of the fact that a lot of your monsters have really goofy designs. Like, I did not expect the butterfly to grow legs and become like a tree creature that was stomping around.
Oh yeah, that's a pretty cool moment. I'm pretty proud of that one.
What was your... How do you even think of stuff like that where, I don't know.
I think that one in specific, as weird as it sounds, I came up with that boss idea. I was at a Whole Foods in the coffee section, and I was like looking around, and then all of a sudden I saw like a coffee bag that was kind of like rainbow colored, and I was like, what if you had a boss that when you shot it, it changed color? And then I was like, what if that boss like flew around, but then later like attached and had a body? and then obviously like chroma was made from that. But I feel like it's all just pretty random. I don't know. When did you end up? How far did you get? I know you were talking about Rooney. Did you end up getting past him or no?
That's as far as I got. This just because I've had a lot of work stuff, so I haven't had a lot of time to play.
Oh, no worries. Rooney's pretty far into the game. Um, I mean, yeah, obviously not like I would say Rooney's probably like a little bit over halfway, probably. Um, there's a couple of the late game bosses that do some pretty wild things.
And how do you come up with the various creature designs and keep them from being repetitive? So far, I've seen exploding manatees. I've seen things that look like trees, but they have a machine gun and they just walk over you and fire down. There's dudes with shields that just kind of punch you.
I think I'm not 100% sure, to be perfectly honest. I think like each area has different play styles I want you to play around. Whether it's like, I think a good example is in the well, right? Um, you have this elevator that's going down and you have all these openings, and whenever you go by an opening, like a new set of enemies charges at you. And some of them are designed to try to kill you, but then there's a specific one that I wanted to affect. Basically at the middle of the elevator you have this light source, okay, and there's a fire on the top, and there's a specific enemy that instead of running at you just runs at the fire and he eats it. And if he eats the fire, it just goes pitch black and he kind of burns you down. And it's pretty hard to recover from that. But I think like focusing I almost focus more on like the environment and that individual experience, and then like how can we make one or two or three enemy pieces that kind of like fit that desired result, I guess.
So I rage quit at the well twice. Um,
That's pretty normal. That's funny.
how do you rationalize the idea that some areas will require players to kind of change up either what weapons that they're rocking with, or what bugs they've equipped, or what powers they have, and
Mhm.
they won't think to do that because with a lot of games you pick your loadout that you feel safe with and you kind of roll the whole game with that. Are you ever
Mhm.
worried that players, when you challenge that safety, that they might fall off the game and not come back?
I think you're always going to lose people one way or another. Um, and I think like specifically with Frogmonster, like the intent was to make it like a challenging, like wow, I felt like I figured that out kind of game. So I'm always pretty careful with, like holding hands too much or, giving people too many hints. And I think my map's a good example of like, it kind of helps you know where progression is, but it also like isn't really, telling you exactly where to go. Um, and I think I don't know, like some people are gonna bounce off of it, and they're gonna hit their brick wall. But I think for the most part, um, you can really make any loadout work with any boss, and the difficulty in the bosses is mostly designed around you needing to learn something as the player in order to beat the boss. Not many of them are specifically just like skill checks where it's like, oh, you can't dash fast enough or you can't whatever, you're gonna die. A lot of them are like, what is the boss's rhythm, right? Like, what are good spaces to stand? What do you do during certain abilities? And I think that helps where most people, it might take 10 tries on a boss, but most people from what I've seen have really been able to get through it. And then also, after you die a couple times, most people realize like, oh, okay, what bugs do I have equipped? Let me check that. And then maybe they're like, oh, that one sounds good here. Um, but I think
That
it is just like a process you have to let the player go through. And some of my favorite games are games that, you know, made me at the end of the day feel like I, figured things out, I guess.
one thing I appreciate about the boss fights being the way they are with multiple stages and phases is that there's almost like a rhythm to them, and so with that, certain bosses are easier with certain weapons or even certain stages of boss fights are better with certain weapons just because they fit within the rhythm that I'm trying to match.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that you had in mind when you were creating weapons? Because I think there's either 8 or 10 different ones. Or was it just a matter of you created a weapon and hopes the player would find the rhythm on their own?
I think it was like I don't know, some bosses obviously like, you know, want you to be close, right? And want you to, you know, hit them in the face really hard. And some bosses are like, hey, that other side of the arena, like you probably should be hanging out there. And I think weapons are naturally kind of suited towards like those different speeds. But also like, you know, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Like Chroma, for example, is a good example where like you're painting the wings to advance the fight, and you know if you just shoot him, you know, 10,000 times with a pistol in the body, it doesn't really do anything. And because of that, some guns that shoot a lot of bullets are really good against Chroma, but then some guns that just shoot a single bullet are really bad. But then you know you have another boss fight out there like Placeholder, where most of the time Placeholder isn't that close to you, and like the bow, you know, it feels pretty good against him. So I think it's really just like a mix of trying to diversify the bosses as much as possible, and the guns kind of just follow suit, I guess.
And what about the upgrades for the guns? Because I feel like a lot of the gun types are a little archetypical. You got your like a pistol, a shotgun, your bow, and then once you start to upgrade them, that's where I think each weapon starts to shine, and you make the weapon yours.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's like a so for people that don't know, there's basically like let's say that I start out with a pistol. So the pistol can go to two paths. Either you can make it a burst fire gun where it shoots I think like 2 or 3 bursts of 3. And then it has a lot quicker reload than the base pistol, which is kind of like a revolver where it reloads each bullet at a time. And then there's the other side where now you have this pierce pistol that does a lot more damage, but kind of holds less rounds. And I think a lot of that is like, you know, what does the player want to do? The bow goes into, you know, an explosive bow or a crossbow that you don't have to pull back. But I think it's been fun to see people really latch on to certain guns as being like, whoa, this gun's so much better than all the other ones. And then you have someone else in the Discord who's like, I hate that gun. That's the worst. Which I think's been pretty fun to see. But in general, like there's just different tools and different enemies, you know, like you get kind of wrecked by different sets of tools. And you know, the guns go even Ooh.
Hmm?
Hello? Oh, sorry, my computer just went black. We're good now.
Okay.
That was fun. I think too, after Rooney, you know, I don't want to spoil too many things, but there is the guns do a little bit more after that, and they get pretty wild.
Damn, I was hoping that wasn't gonna be that wasn't gonna happen, so that I wouldn't miss out on something to talk about.
There's a couple things after Rooney that like have been real fun to have people see who you know get that far, because there's a few things where people are like saying things like I've never done this in a video game before, and that's been really cool to be able to design something like that.
There are a bunch of just really weird, nifty things. I think one of the weirdest ones, I died to a fucking crab.
The little guys on the ground that
Yeah,
click.
I kept trying to shoot it because I didn't understand how to eat bugs at the moment, and I was like, why isn't it dying? And then it just, well, first off, I had to find it because I was just like turning around like, who's there? As there's just a crab poking me in the toes.
Right, because they're loud. They're one of the loudest little enemies. Yeah.
What was, why the crab, and why make it that all he does is switches what hand you're holding the weapon with?
I forever in my demos, you weren't allowed to switch hands, and some people got kind of mad about that. And I always joke to them, frogs are left-handed, even though like I don't really think they are, but you know, I just thought it was a funny joke. But then eventually you hear enough feedback and you're like, okay, well, whatever, I'll give you a setting. But like, I didn't want to make it a setting, so then I was like, okay, we're just gonna have it be crabs, and if you equip a crab, you switch hands. It doesn't cost anything. But crabs actually ended up being a very good way for people who didn't realize you could eat bugs to eat bugs, because you see this little crab on the ground, it's chasing you. It's in the first level. They're in other places too, but you shoot at it, you're like, why is this crab invincible? What do I do? And then you're like, well, I guess I try to lick it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, I can eat all these bugs. How didn't I know this?
That is exactly what happened with me.
Well, there we go. The crabs did their job. I'm glad.
I just think it's funny to have like you created something weird and it ends up serving like a tertiary purpose that you would have never like thought of on your own.
Right. You're like, oh, that's perfect. Because there's been people who, like, I've hopped on, they're streaming or whatever, and I hop on to watch, and like, they're at Marvin and they catch their first bug, and they're like, wait, I can catch bugs?
I remember seeing like the bug list at my first save point, and I was like, all right, let's find the Chow mini game where I do bugs. I think that's how that's gonna work. Let's do this. Another thing
Bugs
that's
are super fun.
another thing that's really interesting about your game is the structure, where it's a Metroidvania, and yeah, I definitely catch the. It, how would you say for people that they would explain where it's like, oh, this feels like the structure of Dark Souls, but it's a frog boomer shooter?
Yeah, it's definitely like I don't know, I'm really like glad, or whenever I was making a game, I was like, I don't want to have levels, right? Like I wanted to do the, the Dark Souls, the Metroidvania, it's not necessarily like an open world, but it's all kind of one connected world. Um and I don't know if you played a lot of traditional kind of Metroidvania kind of games? Like have you played Hollow Knight?
I embarrassingly, I think I beat the first boss, and I just haven't gone back to it. But I have played Dark Souls 1 through 3.
Okay. Hollow Knight kind of bounces off on some people, I think, just because it's so slow in the beginning and so like, yeah, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I need to do. And that process takes a while. But I kind of wanted to mix um like a world where it is a Metroidvania and you are exploring, but I wanted to make it a little bit simpler to help kind of bring in that shooter crowd that I don't think would. I don't know, and it's also like it's or it's third person. No, sorry, it's first person. And like a world being as complex as a Metroidvania, but being in first person without like a super helpful map would probably just break your brain and you would always be lost. Um, so I think that like this model fits that pretty well. And it does feel a lot like a Dark Souls game as far as world design is concerned. I didn't really think about that, but it does really.
Well, it's not. I wouldn't say there's bonfires, but I when I say it feels like the structure is like it's a slog, and I mean that in a good way, where you're like,
Mhm.
okay, there's all these enemies appearing, and I need to get through this section just so that way I could feel the safety of the next save point. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to
Mhm.
retrek through this. Um,
Right.
how do you?
And
Oh, sorry. Continue.
and originally when you died, you did drop your coins and you had to repick them up. But you die a lot in Frogmonster, and there was a point where I was like, I think it's actually, like just let the player die. Don't give them any consequences for it. And I'm kind of glad I made that decision.
What about the decision to have enemies just kind of appear in levels instead of organically already being there or crawling out from walls? They just kind of spawn in.
I think part of that was a constraint on time as far as development is concerned. I was concerned that like, I don't know how many enemy arenas there are in the game, but like if I were to guess, there's probably 50 at least. And I think a lot of that was just a focus on not wanting to, I don't know, being able to make more content and focus on more like of those kind of things versus that specific detail. But I think it also kind of works out because it's all implied that like Rooney or, whoever, whichever creator is, spawning those enemies. Like they're kind of setting traps for you. Um, and that's what you see, those like orbs that pop up. They're kind of like I don't know, they're the spawn fruit, but they're basically just like Rooney, is trying to stop your progress, and those enemy arenas are a little like break from like the enemy arenas are tricky, but they're not nearly as hard as bosses, and they're kind of like a feel good, kill a lot of enemies kind of moment.
Speaking of Rooney, how did you come up with the story for Frog Monster and its overall world?
I think trying to think exactly when this happened, a long time ago. Um I wanted you to feel small. Like I mean, as you walk through any of the towns or the cities or meet the NPCs, the world definitely feels like it wasn't made for you. Um, and I think like you feeling small and like the guns not feeling like, super, super powerful, I think is an intentional decision to be like, you're just a small little frog, and like, you shouldn't be able to beat any of this stuff, but you still are. Um, And then I think like, Rooney and Melora and a lot of the NPC characters all just kind of came from um I don't know, like they all serve different purposes. Like I think almost everyone's favorite character is honestly Trench the Butcher, who, after every boss fight he shows up and he gives you money and comments on the boss a little bit, and then, like he collects them all and he makes soup. And so much of the boss fight for people ended up being like, oh, I get to see Trench after this and being excited about that. And after release, I made 3 challenge bosses, which are kind of harder than the base bosses in the game, and some of them do double damage. And Trench currently isn't implemented for those, and it's almost like people in the community were like, it's just not the same without Trench. Like this is didn't feel like a real boss fight, and I thought that was interesting.
I liked seeing how he cooked the enemies. And then if you go to his little restaurant, there's the different cuts of meat. And I have to say, when I killed like this unagi looking sea serpent and he cut like the big chuck from it, I was like, damn, I would eat sushi from this frog. That looks amazing.
I
And I
know, right?
and I did appreciate his disappointment. You have a boss that's a tree that catches on fire, and he's like, I don't know what to do with this. This is a burnt log.
He's like, yeah, what the hell, dude? Like, should I pay you for this? I don't know.
I
At
do
least he does
appreciate
find
that.
some fruit in the bushes, I guess. But yeah.
He always pays you,
And I
even if
think
you
too,
can't cook
like
with it.
a lot of the characters are designed around jokes. And a lot of them aren't like, super, super in your face. But I don't know. It's just kind of like a fun bringing life to the world and giving you kind of that mental break from like, yeah, everything's like, challenging, but it's also like, I don't know, the NPCs are all a little ridiculous, and I think that adds to the experience.
What about the boss that's like a child that's riding a monster, and then you get to spare the child at the end or kill him?
Oh yeah, Supo. Yeah, Yunoy Supo is pretty fun. I originally, I think I designed Yanoi as a boss fight. And I was starting to make him, and I was like, he's just full melee. Like, I need some ranged elements. And I was like, what if there was like a dude that, was a friend or not? You can decide, but kind of just pops up and starts shooting at you. Um, and like this obnoxious music plays at the end of the fight. Like Supo is, I have people that play the game and they hate Supo and they kill him every time, and then I have people who think Supo's the best. So
He gave his dialogue, and I was like, you didn't learn a thing, and I just shot him in the head. Speaking
R.I.P.
of
Supo.
Rip Supo, I think if you talk to another NPC, he's like, "Man, I wonder where my friend is," and I was like, "Oh, whoops! I'll buy your gun though. I don't know what happened to him, but
I do like that element too, where like you know what happened, but their friend is just really sad and like you killed my friend, and you're just like, yeah, I sorry, I heard something horrible happen to him. Like, oh well.
no regrets about Supo." Another thing I wanted to comment on is Part of your structure is building little safe havens filled with NPCs. And what's your process when it comes to writing NPCs and giving them, I guess, character?
I I really don't. I think my process is not really a process. But I don't know. I kind of like look at, gaps in like some of the NPCs obviously do things. You have, some people that sell things, you have people that you like rescue and you get rewards. Right? Like someone obviously needs to, upgrade your guns. But I don't know, I just like saw gaps in things where I was like, okay, it would feel good if there was another person here, or like, in the Yell Force, for example, like those guards kind of play a little game with you and, make you go fight a boss. And I think that just came from like, I don't know, like designing things and then designing things on top of that and eventually being like, oh, it would be funny if there was someone here messing with you. And I think messing with the player is something that NPCs kind of like to do.
I also try to shoot the guards.
I love when people see them like looking over the fence and then they see their body and you're like, "Oh, you look like that? What the hell?"
That's kind of, yeah, I think by the time I got to the town, I was like, oh, okay, so it's just everyone's massive except for me. Great. Uh,
Correct. It's just like you and Supo and Supa, and that's pretty much it.
there's also Marvin, the tree. I did enjoy his advice where he's like, listen, I was your size, and now I'm huge. You'll get there.
Right? And you're like, "No, I'm not. I'm a frog." Like, what are you talking about? But maybe, maybe you will grow that big. Who knows?
So you have the various different guns, the various different upgrades, the bugs, and then you have powers that you can use, well, spells that you can use that cost mana. How do
Mhm.
you balance all of those things so people can't make just broken like builds, or how do you make things that feel different from one another and they don't just feel like, oh, this spell's the same as this gun, or this spell is the same as that spell?
It's really hard. It takes a lot of like I like to play the game, if we're being perfectly honest, and every time I'm playing through, I'm kind of playing around with like, oh, we'll do this one this time, or we'll do this one that time. And if ever there's bugs or spells or guns that I'm like, yeah, I don't want to pick that one, I'm probably like, okay, this probably needs to be adjusted in some way. Because everything should, provide some interesting advantage that's different than the other ones. And even just coming up with like eight spells that weren't related to, like all the gun variations and things, it was pretty tricky. Um, and some people, really explore and figure out all the strengths of all the spells, and some people generally just stick to a few. But I think either is honestly fine because there's so much else to pick from. But the bug builds, everyone has different favorites, and I think that's really fun to see.
Has there been something you've created that in retrospect you were like, I don't think this is very good, but the community latched on, so you left it in?
Trying to think.
Or is there anything the community loves way more than you do personally?
I don't honestly know. Um, I think like it's fun to hear what people think is the hardest boss because you could not in a million years could you convince me that people thought some of the bosses they think are the hardest. But I think it's been like I don't know, like it's a very like, personal experimental game and I think it's been really fun to have people, like really go in that world and get to experience that. And I think that's been super rewarding for me as like a game dev to see people, curious and asking questions and, trying to figure out what's going on.
Is there anything different you do now that you've seen how people react to your game and you've played it a lot and you've, well, watched the development of it?
I would try to figure out how Twitter compression works and try to make my videos look better on Twitter. I'm trying to think. I don't really know, to be perfectly honest. I'm kind of glad I didn't end up signing with any publishers, just because I really feel like I get kind of freedom to do what I want in that regard. And I don't really enjoy marketing too much, but like I do like the community kind of side of things, and I'm glad I get to manage that. Um, I don't know if I would do anything too differently. I think like when I was originally setting out to do this and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do like over 20 bosses, I was like, yeah, I don't know if that'll ever happen. You're crazy. And then, I did it, but I think that it took a lot longer than I expected. Um, and it was a lot of work, but I think it overall, like, I don't know, I'm happy with how it went.
Were you nervous for release at all?
I was a little bit nervous. I didn't really know. I had my original demo that came out 2 years ago, I think, in February, was the first four bosses of the game. So you played through Yanoi. That set a lot of my like, that's kind of the point where I was like, okay, this formula is working. People like this. Like this is something that works for people. And a couple of months after that is, I think, when I went full time on game dev and started burning my savings. But I think that led to some confidence, as well as I had a I don't know. I luckily, I didn't have really a rushed release at all. So the final month was really just me hanging out with friends, watching them play the game, and I think that helped a lot with like the nervousness of it all. And I don't know, I got lucky on launch day, and my posts did what social media sometimes doesn't do, and it was nice to have people playing, and then you're just so busy like bug fixing and watching streams and stuff that like you can't really even think about it.
What is your approach to creating good platforming? Because it's a frog game, you gotta have platforming in it.
hmm I think 3D platforming is interesting, and it's almost like you can't have too much going on at the same time. And most of my platforms, when you're trying to jump on things, are like way bigger than your character, and I think that helps a lot because it's like, I don't know, first person platforming can either be really good or feel jank. Um, and I think I just tried to make it like as telegraphed and clear as possible. And also, like, not too many bosses really require platforming while fighting the boss. And if they do, like, you have to make the boss a lot simpler because of that. I think Rooney's probably the exception of, you have to do kind of a lot while also, paying attention to the cliffs.
What was, I guess, you said you play through your game a lot so to test things. So what's your favorite area to go back to?
What is my favorite area? I feel like I just love like the Yellow Forest. It's early in the game, but I just love like placeholders are really fun boss for me. I don't know, he's just pretty cool, and I also just like limbs and the whole. I don't know, it's just like a place that you feel like you could live. Um, Obviously that's not the case, but you know what I mean. I'm trying to think of another area that I really like. I also like. There's an area in hard mode, or not hard mode. There's an area post Rooney that has rats in a lot of places, and that is an area that I just like, am super happy with, and I think it just did everything that I wanted it to do.
So this is the second area with rats.
Yes, it's post Rooney. It's the second area with rats, and it's kind of like a multi area, but both of those bosses in there are just absolute bangers, and the main mechanic of the area is just super cool.
I'll have to go through there. Although the very first time I think I raged quit was the fucking rats.
You'd be that, yeah, that right after Marvin, and you drop down and you're like, "Oh no. Oh no." But those rats are really there for the most part, like, making sure people are using spells, because you can get pretty much to that point without ever casting a spell, but the rats make sure you're casting them.
Was there anything else that you did that you tried to implement to tutorialize the player, and do you think you should have added a tutorial?
I think like a lot of things I was okay with letting you figure it out. Um, some people made it a little too far without catching bugs that I think I would, like to help with that a little bit more. Um, but I think too, a lot of what helped is like a lot of my playtesters and friends aren't necessarily like, my target audience. And I think that made me, explain things and onboard them a little better than I would have to if they were, all ultra kill players or something.
I imagine, yeah, there's a difference between some speedrunning ultra kill player and like just someone who like casually plays Mario.
Right. Like my friends are like, yeah, I play some, Minecraft and, maybe some Tarkov every once in a while. And I'm like, okay, good luck.
Have fun with uh, this hedge monster that's a multiple eyes. Good luck.
Right. Like, oh, just send them in. And then, some of the bosses were a lot harder, and then you have someone play test and you're like, oh, that's not even fair. So I have one friend in particular who most of the bosses he had to face, he's always like, is this one fair or not? And I'm like, probably not. Good luck.
What's an enemy that in retrospect you're like, I needed to tone that down. That was rough.
Um, I think. Oh, there's an area under the Undercity called the Undercity because obviously, that's a good name for it. Um, and there's an enemy that sneezes and shoots like this projectile forwards that does 2 damage. And pretty close up until release, that enemy like almost seeked on you if you didn't jump. And people would always try to side dash and it would just like delete them. So like right before release, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna nerf the crap out of them, and I'm kind of glad I did because they still kill people sometimes as is.
Have you played Dark Souls 1?
Like forever ago and with a friend, so I don't know if I could necessarily recall very much from it.
Do you remember those fuckers in Blighttown that just always like fucking hit you with blight?
I absolutely hated that area. I will tell you that much.
That's what I'm imagining. There's just like a blowtorch guy that's just doing a ton of damage by like hitting you with darts, and you're like, well, I don't know what to do now.
There's so many moments in that game that I just remember being like, we're almost like we made it further than last time. Like, let's go, let's go. And then it's just like insta killed by something. You're like, oh, that exists. Okay, cool.
I do, because you always, when you get to an arena fight, you have to redo the whole wave if you die. And there is
Hmm.
one area where you have to jump across lily pads to maintain like things that push on you, and then you just spawn I think three enemies that tank a bunch of hits and chase you, and I'm like, oh, this is the end. I'm not getting past this arena. Great.
Yeah, it's good to like I like the arena format too because it's like quick pieces of challenge. Um, but it's never like I think I'm pretty generous with save points and I always make sure like before challenges I want to save point as close to that as possible so when you respawn you're like okay what did I die to, okay let's go try it again. And I was nice unlike Dark Souls and like pretty much every boss has a save point directly in front of them.
So I guess I'll leave this with my final question, which is going to be, how do you determine what is too bullshit versus just enough bullshit when it comes to designing combat or bosses?
I think part of it is luckily I have, some friends and specifically my girlfriend, like when she's playtesting things, if there's ever anything that's like tuned up a little too much, she'll just like, look at me and be like, "Okay, come on. Like what is that?" And I think it's helpful to have those people that like, will just be like, "All right, come on." But also like I don't know, it's something that I want bosses to be learnable, and because of that, I generally, before having anyone play, I'll make sure like, okay, can I, hit list this boss a few times in a row, or like, can I consistently beat this boss in a way that like it's because I learned, how to deal with X, Y, or Z. And I think that makes it fair, where it's not just like, I don't know. And then another thing too is like, animations telling the player what to do, I think is important, I'm a big Dark Souls loves to do like, animations that fake you out or animations that like, they swing way too slow. And I wanted to kind of avoid that because, that can sometimes lead to the player being like, this is, frustrating. And, it's whenever you die, I want it to be like, oh, I died because, my fault. And I think just designing around that helped a lot with like, yeah, it's challenging, but at the same time, like, you can learn and get past what you're doing without, just memorizing things.
It's not a Souls-like, but I'm thinking back to Mordhau, which is like it's kind of like Chivalry. It's a medieval combat simulator, in the
Okay.
sense that
I
like
think I've seen it.
when you swing your sword, you can do these things called accels and decels, where it's the same exact animation, but you can either accelerate the animation or you can decelerate the animation. And every single time someone swings a fucking maul and slows it down, I think I'm ready and I block too early and die. Every single time.
I could see that being literally impossible. Right.
Yep, and then they don't wear any armor. They call them naked mall men because they just really want to rub it in that they're gods. But
You like queue up with them and you're like, oh, I'm gonna lose, aren't I? And then they're like, yeah, sorry.
well, it's just like one guy that's naked in a battlefield of all armored knights, and he just like will walk through the field carving his way towards someone he doesn't like, and you're like, I better not end up on his shit list. But that's what I think of when I think animation mismatching is just you can really fuck with players if you speed up an animation that they were not expecting or slow it down.
Right. It can get frustrating pretty quick.
So I think that's everything. Is there anything you want to shout out while I have you on? Maybe another dev or a local pizza place?
Oh, there's a dev that has a Kickstarter out right now. He's Tim from, I think his name is Tim, but it's called They Came from Dimension X, and it's on Kickstarter. And you guys should check it out and see what you think. It's a pretty cool, unique game with a lot of character to it. And I hope the Kickstarter works out for him.
I'll do my best to make sure that ends up in the description. Yeah, I want to thank
Awesome.
everyone for listening to this. You can find Benjamin on Twitter and on. Is there any other social media you're on?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously, I think you should play Frogmonster, but I don't know, Discord's a great place to reach me, and we have a channel for Frogmonster that's been a lot of fun.
Well, you'll be able to find him there. I'll make sure to put all that in the description. Yeah, my podcast, if you're listening on YouTube, you're here, but there's also Spotify and Podbean and all that kind of stuff. I'm on X, Threads, and Blue Sky, mostly X, but I mean Twitter, whatever it's called. That might change because that site's a hellhole. And then I do have a link tree. It's also going to be in the description with a Ko-Fi if you want to support the podcast. And I think that's everything. So until next time, I'll see everyone later. Bye.